Willkommen in einem Video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 3 of my video series of covering the Core Commander training videos. In this case I'll be providing an overview of fire combat, including smoke barrages, direct fire and indirect fire. Only indirect fire elements can fire a smoke barrage. There are many vehicles which are equipped with smoke dispensers or smoke generators. These cannot lay a smoke barrage, and instead this provides tactical advantages for that vehicle only. In order to fire smoke ammunition, or an indirect fire element must be equipped with smoke ammunition. Players should check this carefully, as many weapons, which you would normally expect to do so, do not have smoke ammunition available. This is listed in the equipment data charts. The second restriction is that, unless organic to a battalion or stated before the game, indirect fire elements can only fire smoke once per 4 game turns. A smoke barrage can be pre-planned as area fire in the same manner as standard area fire. Players nominate an indirect fire element, a target location, and a game turn the smoke barrage is to arrive before the game begins. If the location is very specifically stated, then the smoke barrage arrives on this location. If the location is not specific, then the owning player selects a location, or rough location, consistent with the recorded instructions, and throws 2d6 dice to determine if the location has moved and where it has moved to. A player can cancel this mission any time before it is to arrive, but note the 1 game turn delay in communication. This means the mission must be cancelled the game turn before it is to arrive, which requires the order to be sent the previous game turn. A mission cannot occur if there are no observers which can see the fall of shot, or if the indirect fire element is not in a position to conduct indirect fire, such as if it was no longer emplaced. If the mission is not stopped, then the owning player does not need to do anything except place the smoke barrage on the playing area on the scheduled game turn and during the area fire smoke barrage step within the smoke barrage sub-phase. A smoke barrage can be ordered during the game in the same manner as fire support missions. The indirect fire element must be integral or allocated to the same headquarters as the observer requesting the fire support mission. If allocated, the indirect fire element must be emplaced and must be under a fire support mission order. The indirect fire element must possess smoke ammunition and be otherwise able to fire smoke. During the fire support indirect fire step, within the indirect fire subphase, an observer can request a smoke barrage to fall on top of or in front of an observed enemy element. This occurs immediately and the smoke barrage is placed in front of or on top of the observed enemy element. The smoke barrage size will vary based on the type of indirect fire element and its size. For example, a 105mm howitzer element of strength 4 can lay a smoke barrage of 6 cm wide by 3 cm deep. Medium mortars combined at the battalion level can fire a single smoke barrage of 3 cm by 3 cm for each 2 strength points. This is to reflect the fact that mortars are actually dispersed among the companies within the battalion rather than being in a single battery of mortars. Smoke affects observation, direct fire and indirect fire. If an element is within and more than 1 cm from the edge of a smoke barrage, it cannot be observed from the outside and neither can it observe out. If an element is within 1 cm of the edge, it can be observed using the -4 observer modifier, and it can observe outward with no penalty. If both observer and the target are within smoke, they can only observe each other if within 2 cm. If the target of direct or indirect fire is in smoke, there is a -2 fire combat penalty. If an element is conducting direct fire and it's in smoke, there is also a -2 fire combat penalty. We will now look at direct fire, specifically occurring during the direct fire subphase. Other types of direct fire, such as half fire and opportunity fire, will be covered in their own specific training videos. In order to conduct direct fire, an element must have a direct fire effectiveness value at the range and against the type of target being fired against. A target is either armoured or soft. An element will have a row for armoured targets and a row for soft targets on the equipment data chart. Cross-reference this with a range to the target. If there is a numeric value, then direct fire can occur. If there is no value, or the value is an alpha character, it either has to use indirect fire or is not eligible to conduct direct fire. The firing element must be able to observe the target. This by definition requires a line of sight. In addition, the firing element must not be depleted, limbered or disrupted. If an element is in travel mode, its ability to conduct a direct fire is reduced to 1 strength point. The Core Commander rules allows an element to fire out of any of its sides. The first step is to determine the fire effectiveness value of the firing element. This is dependent on whether the target is armoured or soft. In this case, the T-62 is armoured. The M1 then uses the armoured row, which is the top row in the entry for the M1 in the equipment data charts. It is assumed that the target is observed at this point, so the firer needs to determine the exact distance between it and the target. In this case, it's 20 centimetres. The M1 then cross-references 20 centimetres with the armoured row to arrive at a fire effectiveness value of 14. The next step is to determine the defensive effectiveness of the target, which in this case is 9. We can then identify the target's aspect, which in this case is medium or standard. Finally, we need to determine the firing element's strength, which in this case is 6. We now have all the information required to conduct direct fire. We now need to determine the fire value. We first identify the row which corresponds to the target's defensive effectiveness of 9. We move across this row until we find the firer's fire effectiveness value of 14. This identifies the basic fire value, which is 10. This value can be modified, and we now need to look at any modifiers which may apply. In this case, there are no modifiers, so we can now cross-reference the basic fire column of 10 with a firer's strength of 6, arriving at a fire value of 15. We now use the calculated fire value of 15 and spin a 10-sided dice on the fire loss table to determine the final direct fire result. There are no modifiers, so we can use the raw die roll results. The die roll is a 7, which is cross-referenced with the fire value of 15, resulting in a 3. This 3 is 3 strength point loss. The element is dispersed, and because it suffered 2 or more losses in a single fire combat, it must take a morale test. There are no morale test modifiers, and the morale of the element is 6. The player spins a 10-sided dice and the result is 5, which is 2 less than the element's morale, and as a result there is no effect. It effectively has passed the morale test. We'll now look at a soft target, in this case a mechanised infantry element on foot. We use the soft row at 20 centimetres to arrive at a fire effectiveness of 2. The next step is to determine the defensive effectiveness of the target, which in this case is soft. Finally, we need to determine the firing element strength, which in this case is 6. We now have all the information required to conduct direct fire against a soft target. We now determine the fire value. We first identify the row which corresponds to the defender's defensive effectiveness as soft. We move across this row until we find the firer's fire effectiveness value of 2. This identifies the basic fire value, which is 3. This value can be modified, left or right, and we now need to look at any modifiers which may apply. In this case, there are no modifiers, so we now run our finger down and cross-reference the base fire column of 3 with a firer's strength of 6, arriving at a fire value of 6. We now use the calculated fire value of 6 and spin a 10-sided dice on the fire loss table to determine the final direct fire result. There are no modifiers, so we can use the raw die roll result. The die roll is a 7, which is cross-referenced with a fire value of 6, resulting in a 1. This results in 1 strength point loss, and the element is dispersed. This lists the defender's direct fire modifier, which affects the basic fire column, that is, left or right, with a plus shifting the column to the right and a negative shifting it to the left. If the column shifts below 1, there is no effect, and if it shifts above 12, for each shift beyond 12 results in a +1 on the fire loss table die roll. The main modifiers which would commonly be used are the target aspect, from very large to very small, and the dispersed in terrain modifiers. This lists the attacker's direct fire modifiers, which affect the basic fire column, with a plus shifting the column to the right and a negative to the left. If the column shifts below 1, the fire combat results in a no effect, and if it shifts above 12, then for each shift beyond 12, add 1 on the fire loss table die roll. This lists the fire loss modifiers which are applied to the 10-sided die roll. Elements which are highly trained have a significant advantage as their die rolls gain a +1. On the other hand, poorly trained elements have a significant disadvantage due to their -1 modifier. We will now look at indirect fire, specifically occurring during the indirect fire subphase. Other types of indirect fire, such as indirect fire in the direct fire subphase, is possible and is briefly covered, although it is very rare. Area fire, interdiction fire and counter battery fire is covered in other videos. In order to conduct indirect fire, an element must have an indirect fire effectiveness value at the range being fired at. The indirect fire values are classed as visible, effective and maximum. Visible is for any target which is self-observed or visible by the indirect fire element. Effective and maximum are for targets not visible by the indirect fire element. The ranges are in centimetres and specific focus should be provided to the minimum range, which is the minimum range allowed. Any target closer is in the dead ground of the indirect fire element, and in this case the indirect fire element will need to conduct direct fire or may not be allowed to conduct any kind of fire. If the indirect fire element has a fire effectiveness value at the range being fired at, it can conduct indirect fire. Indirect fire does not require a line of sight, but it does require the indirect element or an observer being able to observe the target, which in turn needs a direct line of sight. If the indirect fire element can observe the target, it can conduct self-observed indirect fire. If it cannot observe the target, but an observer can observe it, it is able to call down fire support. Then observer-sighted indirect fire can occur. In addition, the firing element must not be depleted, limited or disrupted. Core Commander rule allows an element to fire out of any of its sides. The first step is to determine the fire effectiveness value of the firing element, which is the same if the target is armoured or soft. The fire needs to determine the exact distance between it and the target. In this case it's 90 centimetres. The SU-122 then cross-references 90 centimetres with the indirect fire range to arrive at a fire effectiveness value of 6. It is in effective range, which happens to be 92 centimetres. The next step is to determine the defensive effectiveness of the target, which in this case is 14. Finally, we need to determine the firing element's strength, which in this case is 6. We now have all the information required to conduct indirect fire. We now need to determine the fire value. We first identify the row which corresponds to the target's defensive effectiveness of 14, which in this case is the 13 plus row. We move across this row until we find the fire effectiveness value of 6, or more specifically 6 and 7. This identifies the basic fire value, which is 1. This value can be modified, left or right. We now need to look at any modifiers which may apply. In this case, there are no modifiers, so we can now cross-reference the basic fire column of 1 with the fire strength of 6, arriving at a fire value of 2. We now use the calculated fire value of 2 and spin a 10-sided dice on the fire loss table to determine the final direct fire or indirect fire results. There are no modifiers, so we can use the raw die roll result. Die roll is 7, which is cross-referenced with a fire value of 2, resulting in dispersed. This results in a 1 strength point loss, or the element is dispersed instead. We'll now look at a soft target. First step is to determine the fire effectiveness value of the firing element, which is the same if the target is armoured or soft. The fire needs to determine the exact distance between it and the target, which in this case is 90 centimetres. The SU-122 then cross-references 90 centimetres with the indirect fire range to arrive at a fire effectiveness value of 6. It is in effective range, which happens to be 92 centimetres. The next step is to determine the defensive effectiveness of the target, which in this case is soft. Finally, we need to determine the firing element's strength, which in this case is 6. We now have all the information required to conduct indirect fire against a soft target. We now need to determine the fire value. We first identify the row which corresponds to the target effectiveness of soft. We move across this row until we find the firer's fire effectiveness value of 6. This identifies the basic fire value, which is 8. The value can be modified left or right, and we can now need to look at any modifiers which may apply. In this case, there are no modifiers, so we now cross-reference the basic fire column of 8 with the fire strength of 6, arriving at a fire value of 10. We once again return to the fire loss table, which is used quite a bit. We now use the calculated fire value of 10 and spin a 10-sided dice on the fire loss table to determine the final indirect fire result. There are no modifiers, so we can use the raw die roll result. The die roll is 7, which is cross-referenced with a fire value of 10, resulting in a 2. This results in 2 strength point loss and the element is dispersed. This lists the Defender's indirect fire modifiers, which affect the basic fire column, with a plus shifting the column to the right and the negative shifting it to a left. If the column shifts below 1, the fire combat has no effect. If it shifts above 12, for each shift beyond 12, you add 1 to the fire loss table die roll. The main modifiers which would commonly be used are the dispersed in terrain modifiers. This lists the attacker indirect fire modifiers, which affect the basic fire column with a plus shifting to the left and a negative shifting to the right. If the column shifts below 1, no effect. Shifts above 12, then add 1 for each shift above 12 on the fire loss table die roll. This is the fire loss modifier table, which is exactly the same as the one that we covered in the direct fire. It's the same CRT. The main modifiers here are if the elements happen to be experienced or inexperienced. Observer-sighted indirect fire is indirect fire which occurs in the indirect fire subphase, which is called in by a separate observer. This represents the bulk of indirect fire. The indirect fire element cannot see the target. Instead, an observer is sighting the target and, if eligible, can call in indirect fire. This is also referred to as normal observed fire support or observer-sighted attacks. If an indirect fire element is allocated or integral to a battalion, then any element in the battalion can observe for that indirect fire element. If an indirect fire weapon is allocated or integral to a regiment or brigade, then the headquarters or any element directly subordinate to the headquarters can observe for that indirect fire element. This includes any subordinate battalion headquarters, but does not include any element subordinate to the battalion headquarters. If the indirect fire element is integral to the battalion headquarters, it does not need to be in place. If the indirect fire element is allocated to the battalion headquarters, it must be in place and under a fire support mission. It should be noted a regimental headquarters can allocate a subordinate integral indirect fire element to a subordinate battalion headquarters, but in this case it must be in place. If it is attached, the indirect fire element then the indirect fire element is considered as integral. And so we come to an end of part 3, in this case covering Core CommanderFire combat. Players should look at the next training video to continue this epic adventure. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.